Hello and welcome to the Root and the Wound podcast. I am your co-host, Trevor Brown.
And I'm Paula Gasparini Santos.
On the podcast, as you know, if you're a listener, we go deep into what is driving our patterns, our behaviors. We get to the root of what drives us so we can see it clearly and change it if we would like to.
And on today's episode, we're going to explore overcoming our own narcissism, which is a wonderful, juicy topic. And I'm going to let Trevor introduce why we're going to do this, what elicited this idea in the first place.
It is totally juicy. I love any of those topics we do where we take a word that's so casually thrown around and we really try to unpack it and get to the root of what what was that word actually intended for back when it came into when it started to be used as a term. Freud, which we'll go to today, what did he mean by it, and how has it been sort of hijacked by cultural trends now? It's always a juicy topic of exploration when we do that.
Yeah, this one will probably be edgy because I know there's a lot of people that like to hold on to these very rigid definitions of having experienced narcissism and has very gray or black and white thinking. So I hope today, like our goal would be to get to the root, to unpack a little bit more of a gray space around this theme that I think we all experience. So let's start by introducing, which like I was so fascinated when you told me about it, the podcast you were listening to that kind of framed this idea, and then let's unpack from there.
Yeah, so a while back I found a podcaster and he's also on YouTube. He's a psychoanalyst. He's been a teacher for decades. His name is Don Carveth. He's incredible. I recommend checking him out for any interested listeners. And he had a podcast a few months ago. It's called On Narcissism. And in the podcast, he makes the case that the way that Freud initially thought of therapy was that it is primarily about overcoming our narcissism and experiencing more openness to love, a natural ability to love. In other words, the more narcissistic we are, the less capable of love we are. The more capable of love we are, by his definition, the less narcissistic we are. And Don Carveth was speaking about Freud's 1914 paper titled On Narcissism, where he really spells this out, that this is the heart of psychoanalysis, that this is what it's supposed to be, to get us outside of ourselves so we can more fully love others. Now,
Mm.
as Don spells out in the podcast, I won't go into all the details. Freud eventually abandons that idea. And then it becomes more about mental health. But it wasn't psychotherapy wasn't always about mental health the way we so automatically think of it now, but it was about overcoming narcissism in the interest of love.
Mm. I love I love this framework, and since we're talking about mental health as well,
Mhm.
right? Like let's just for the listeners understand that typically when we let's like frame what narcissism is known as today
Yeah.
and how we're going to talk about it and unpack, right? Because in today's world, we're often throwing this word casually out there, narcissism to refer to basically narcissistic personality disorder. And on that note, people are throwing that they are experiencing narcissistic partners and labeling people narcissistic when, in fact, the statistics of that actual diagnosis is very small.
Interesting.
Right. So we are talking about narcissism broadly and like telling a lot of people that they are narcissists. And yet the diagnosis that we are framing that wording for others is very like actually small part of the population, which actually is an argument for what we're about to unpack with narcissism, that like all of us have narcissism inside of us. And maybe that is why we're finally talking about it so openly, and yet we're holding on to an old framework of narcissism being this like shadowy bad person that only a few people have. And
Mm.
that limits our ability to see the universal experience of the narcissism within self and other. What do
So
you think about that?
totally. Yeah, no, that was so well articulated. Yeah, so let's try to define our terms a little bit. It might help to look at the disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder to an extent, but I'm so much more interested in what you brought up there, which is the way in which we all are narcissistic, and we're all that narcissism might come out in different ways. But as Freud initially conceived of therapy, as Don Carveth currently conceives of his work, it's about overcoming narcissism. And this narcissism, I think the sort of broad stroke definition for what he's speaking about is not self-love, but it's self-obsession. It's
Hmm.
self-preoccupation.
Hmm.
It's self-encapsulation, being able to get out of our own perspective and take on the perspective of others. Being able or an inability to really sympathize with the position of the other, with the well-being, the internal well-being of the other person, and have care and concern for that. To actively be putting them maybe at the forefront of our mind, their genuine well-being. Um, and so maybe broad stroke definition for the narcissism we all have is simply self-absorption, self-obsession, self-preoccupation. What do you make of that?
I think absolutely. I frame it like I love the fragmented perspective of like we all have these parts within self, right? Like I think of narcissism is very much a part of our ego structure. It is how ego maintains its own form, right? And when I say ego, it's that part of us that's trying to protect us from something, from vulnerability, from hurt, from pain. So when we are in that more egoic mind, we are self-absorbed, we are self-focused because we are survival focused, right? We're like thinking of our survival.
Yeah.
And when we are in that framework, we are inherently more self-serving, selfish, self-consumed, right? Because it's like that mechanism of there's a threat and now we're tunnel visioned in our perspective, in
Mm.
our search, and
Mm.
I believe that that's where a lot of this narcissism stems from, not this misconceived idea of like, oh, he's a narcissist, oh, she's a narcissist, and it's like just a black and white, like that's a bad person that does not have capacity for empathy, does not have capacity to think of others, selfish, is only thinking about self. I actually think if we start thinking of those people as like they are afraid, they are living in their egoic state, right? We would actually see that narcissism is the fear of expansion, the fear of love, the fear of vulnerability, and maybe we would have more conversations around it that would feel less black and white, right?
Totally. Totally. Narcissism, okay, that's nice. A fear of love and vulnerability, a retreat into self, into the egoic experience of self, out of that fear, in the face of that fear. And then narcissism exists much more on a spectrum than on a checkbox. Yes, no, you have it, you don't. But it's on a spectrum across people, but even in our own selves, our own behavior. There's times where I'm more narcissistic and times when I'm less narcissistic,
Mhm.
depending on a whole host of factors. Hopefully, in time, over time, I'm reducing my overall baseline experience of narcissism, so that it's fading away, but I'm probably unlikely to totally ever overcome it.
Right,
Um,
as one will never overcome the ego.
right, exactly, exactly. There's people out there who say they do, but who knows? And I am not one of them.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the way that you're constructing it here, just to ensure we're really on the same page, is that narcissism is a retreat into self and a preoccupation with self. It's a contraction in the face of an invitation to expand, to move towards others that feels dangerous and threatening. And so then we
Mhm.
come back into self.
And usually subconscious, right? That threat is not even
Yes,
sometimes a
100%.
conscious threat to the individual that's experiencing or projecting the narcissistic behaviors, right? Like it's usually a subconscious fear that leads this self-obsession, leads this self-protection.
Right. Right. Okay, so in that sense, yeah, it's maybe an outdated, I don't know if that's quite the right term, but it's just a mode of self-protection. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So then would you agree then that the antidote to narcissism, the antonym to narcissism, is love, care, and concern for the other? That both as we develop that capacity to do it and as we naturally find ourselves doing it, we are overcoming our narcissism.
Yeah, I think like I just got like a blast because I have like such a visual mind
Mhm.
that I got this blast of, as you're saying, like what is the antonym of it? It's like it's the willingness to surrender self, right? Like at the end of the
Yes.
day, if self-absorption is the category of narcissism, why I think love is how a lot of narcissism gets erased is because love requires us to surrender self to something bigger than self, right? Like, so in the act of surrendering self, our narcissism naturally dissolves because now we're letting that boundary that was protective melt and letting something in, right? And that's the fear. And like if we think of ego, ego's whole mission is continuity of self, right? That little self that it thinks it is.
Yep.
And so if we're gonna blend that self with something else, ego loses itself, and that's why it holds on tighter.
Totally. Totally.
Right.
Yeah. Its entire mission is to sustain itself.
Yes.
Anything that threatens that, it's going to retract and double down on the defensive behavior in an effort
Yeah.
to
Or
maintain.
fight the thing that is
Mhm.
trying to melt it, right? Which is why we're talking like pop psychology in the world today. Most of the time, at least that I hear the word narcissism thrown out, it's in relationship dynamics,
For
right?
sure.
Like
For
he
sure.
was a narcissist, she was this. And hey, I'm guilty of having previously diagnosed partners as narcissists. Because what I was really referring to is my partner had a lack of capacity to surrender self into our relationship. And so there was rigidity, there was lack of empathy for certain things that were happening in our relationship. And I myself have shown up narcissistic in other relationships, right? But it took a lot of gray thinking in my own accord, my own journey, to even be able to say that it's not black and white. Like, I'm not a narcissist and this person is. I can now say I was narcissistic here and I wasn't here.
Hmm.
What was the difference there?
Hmm.
Right? And I
Hmm.
could usually, when I reflect on the relationships that I showed up more narcissistically, I had a lot more fear than the ones when I was able to show up with a lot more love and empathy.
Interesting. Interesting. So then it was overcoming the fear that was the avenue to overcoming the narcissism, I suppose.
Yeah.
Would you conceptualize it like that? Yeah. As you're talking, I'm thinking about my own experiencing and in my marriage. There are days and moments when I'm less narcissistic and days and moments when I'm more narcissistic. Days and moments when my wife will point out something about my behavior and I immediately retreat into a posture of defensiveness and become self-focused and self-obsessed and want to prove myself somehow in her eyes. And then there's moments where I'm just so much more receptive. And I'm just like, yeah, totally. You're right. I can see how that would have upset you. I can see how that would have hurt you. I'm sorry. I love you. Because I love you, I can hear you and I want to do it differently next time. That feels so much better. And then we're
Yeah.
on the other side. There's connection, there's less self-preoccupation. But I'm in this moment, I'm just wondering what's the difference for me? Like maybe you mentioned fear, and I'm just kind of letting that percolate. If somehow in those moments, somehow here I'm more afraid and I'm therefore more narcissistic or defensive, and here somehow less afraid and therefore more open and receptive.
Mm-hmm.
The other, I'm not entirely sure, but I
Mm-hmm.
think that just naming it as we are that it's not something that we just totally overcome once and for all and then get to live this like selfless existence
Mhm.
free of narcissism.
Which is like my belief, right? That we don't overcome ego. We live a parallel journey with like our conscious self, higher self, and then the lower self, the ego self, right? Like that those two will exist, like our soul and our biology, right? Like if there's a soul, then there's also the biological lower self. Like it's not one or the other, right? It's an embodied consciousness, which means that it's a consciousness that also embodies the ego self and is able to track, like, oh, yeah, there it is, right? Like,
Mhm.
there it is. There it is.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if we can ever truly overcome the ego, but I do think we come into better relationship to the ego where we could hear that it is from the ego that we are speaking and more able to reflect and do that return to true self quicker, right? Like surrender that fearful self and go back to true self, like you're saying you do in your marriage, like where there are moments you're in defense, protecting, and
Mhm.
then something softens where you're able to go into the reflective state of bigger than self and go, oh yeah, wait, here we go. I can surrender this, right? It's like
Mhm.
we can offer that ego up for dissolution and trade that defense for connection.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think of the mythology, and maybe I'm wrong, but the like whole Narcissus, staring at the
Mhm.
reflection of self in the water.
Yeah.
And I think about the fragility of that, right? Like if we are looking at water and like this is me, like it's like my reflection, water is so malleable and so ever changing. And when we look at that kind of egoic self, that narcissism within us all, the narcissist part of us is holding on to such a fragile identity that is so ever changing, right? And rain will come and ripple the water that's going to change it. And something else is going to come and change the surface of the water. And it's going to create franticness. Like, personally, when I've lived from a narcissistic state, it is so frightening. It is so frightening because you're trying to maintain a image, a reflection of self that is so vulnerable to change and
It's
influence.
constantly changing. In this, to use that story, that metaphor, that's really beautiful. I never thought about that. That he's staring into the water and the water's constantly moving, quite literally, or at the very least at risk of moving, which would create such a frantic
Sure.
desperation inside oneself that I need to cling on even harder. But
Yeah.
the more I cling, the more it's narcissistic, the more anxious I become. And because it's outside of my control, I can't control my reflection in the water. Uh,
Yeah.
so I have to be obsessed with it in a sense. Eh, Because precisely because I cannot control it, I try all the harder to
And
control.
obsessed with maintaining it, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
obsessed with like I'm gonna create some form of shelter to protect
Yeah.
this little
Yeah,
reflection
right, right.
so
I'll
that
build a dam
nothing,
up around it so other waves can't get in.
right? And then that's where I think like the more narcissistic skewed personality structure is living with way more fear, way more anxiety, way more rigidness, right? Which is why love can't come in, because love is gonna come in and be like, "Psh, you're actually the water. You're not that reflection, right? Like you're the water. You're everything.
If if you, I don't recall much of this, and so maybe you do, or we can leave it. But
Or
the narcissistic personality disorder, like in the literature, I was reading something recently that it's like the fundamental wound when it really wounds somebody. It doesn't, although we all are narcissistic to a degree, we don't all have the diagnosis. There
right,
is a qualitative difference. Um, but on top of that, and this might be sidetracking us, the borderline personality disorder comes in to almost manage like the deeper wound of the narcissistic personality disorder. And so that narcissistic wound is what it's like not being able to trust in a developing sense of self, right? So we have to replace the self with the image. Like we're not adequately received by the eyes of the other, by the mother or the father. Like we feel ourselves to be fundamentally inadequate and unworthy of love, and then we have to obsess about our image in an effort to try to get some fragments of the love.
Mhm.
um, is this resonate? Is this true as far as you recall?
Sure, yeah, yeah. And I
Okay.
also would love to put just a little asterisk
Mhm.
because I think it's so controversial too. Like, there's also multiple perspectives of the DSM diagnosis as a whole, right? Like, I know we come from a more holistic education that has willingness to look at even how these diagnoses were formed in the first place and how some theorists, which I like that theory perspective, where it's like every diagnosis in the book is really pointing to a coping mechanism, right? Like how a person learned to survive the wounding of lacking love. Um, and so narcissism, how you just described it, very much so, right? Like that child that did not receive that experience of feeling loved and worthy in the eyes of the parent, learned to feel worthy to self, right? To to control a sense of self that didn't feel like it had a place in the world, right? And then it makes it either grandiose or whatever. It has to do something to that experience that was lacking.
Yeah, and it has to become obsessed with the image
Yes.
because he or she is not allowed the natural expression of their inner authenticity has been rejected. So they have to figure out the thing that's less rejected. And then they
Yeah.
have to obsess with the image in the water, which is constantly changing. And then, and that's the other way that I understand that myth. And again, I really love that water element he brought in. That's awesome. And the other way I understand it, I guess it goes back to the definition of self-obsession, but it's not even self-obsession. It's a substitute for self.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
obsession with the image. It's
The
idolatry.
false self. Yeah.
Yeah, the false idol.
Mhm.
We
The
necessarily
mask.
become obsessed with the mask, with maintaining the mask, with maintaining the image. Then there's so little even life in that. There's a certain
Because the mask protected at one point.
it was necessary. It
Yeah.
was yeah. We had to construct a mask. We were forced to.
Mhm.
The is again at varying levels, perhaps, but where it's a true narcissistic disorder is the way the DSM would describe it. It was this necessary. No way around it.
Mhm.
The rigidity of the mask. Um, okay. Wow. We're
It's a
getting
lot. I
it's
know.
a
I'm
lot.
like, we're getting
Super
deep. We
interesting.
always go deep.
Super interesting.
Well, and to bring in also, if
Mhm.
we're gonna keep going on the myth, right? Like
Mhm.
there is the less spoken about part of Narcissus. The character Narcissus was the other character Echo, which was in the myth the woman that was echoing back that that's like that image and everything is right. So I also believe
Mhm.
there is a maintenance of narcissism in our relationships and our societies. And I could also state that when I was more in my mask identity, the person that I was in relationship with was echoing back to me, like, proud and like admiration of that mask,
Look at that image. Beautiful.
which, which helped me maintain it. And I have um, echoed to other partners that that mask was worthy as well and loved, those parts and that I'm maintaining those fragments in my partner, right? Like so there's also a relationship to that like I'm only going to become obsessed with the reflection in the water if that reflection in the water is getting validation and love, right? And like that's the thing that I'm seeking. So now I'm obsessed with keeping that image in the water because that's what drawing in the foundational biological need we all have for connection and love and worthiness, right?
Right. Right. Yep. And then when that image in the water gets messed up or gets criticized or something or gets called into question, then we double down, most of us, in our efforts to build it back up or to merge with it again or to lead with it or to defend it. Yeah. And that bid for connection. Right.
Mhm.
Right. Totally.
And and I think to get like more ethereal, because like we are calling the topic overcoming our own narcissism.
Uh-huh.
So let's maybe get to a little bit of the root of how do we overcome it,
Hmm.
right? Like maybe let's trace that path a little bit of,
Hmm.
I think like first is understanding that like there's part of self in a reflection, right? Like even from a physics perspective, like when we're seeing a reflection of ourselves, there's part of us there. And there's part of that reflection that we are admiring that is true identity, all right? But that's, I think, the discernment work of, I'm trying to think of like a more physical example, and I would rather use like my own narcissism than a partner's or someone's I've experienced. But like when I in my marriage, when I was in my 20s, that's the relationship that I really think I showed up way more narcissistic in. And when I think about what that narcissistic mask showed up as was like a girl always in control, a girl who like always had her shit together,
Hmm.
right? Like didn't need help, didn't need anybody, which like so clearly now was me avoiding the vulnerability of need because my childhood trauma was that like when I needed the people I needed to take care of me, they weren't there. And so need just felt like the most vulnerable thing in the world. So my narcissism that I was praised for was my hyper independence.
Hmm.
And how that showed up narcissistic that really wounded my husband was that I pushed him out,
Hmm.
right? Anytime I experienced need, instead of just being vulnerable to that need, I made him feel like something was wrong with him
Hmm.
because I didn't want to ever admit to myself that I needed him,
Right. Right.
right?
It's too terrible.
Now, terrified, right? Terrified. Now I can look back with so much self-forgiveness and so much empathy for the pain I caused him, right? Because imagine trying to love, especially him. He was the most kind, loving person, right? The biggest echo of love. And he was trying to come in, trying to love me. And I'm like, nope, I don't need love. Nope, I don't need anything, right? And it's like when I think about the overcoming of that, it took like not fragmenting my identity further, not going like, oh, the resilience, the part of me that's strong and able to stand on her own is all narcissist, right? It's all bad.
Yeah.
No, the strength in me that I was reflecting in that mask was authentically me, right? This part of me
Mhm.
that's like able to turn shit into like self-generative energy. That's the artist in me, right? That actually was like the pure part of me. What was the mask was the stating of I can't, like I don't need anybody,
Mhm.
right? It was actually me
Yes,
getting to a more whole identity within myself of I am independent and I have need, and
exactly.
that those two don't clash.
Exactly.
So I really feel like overcoming narcissism at its core demands holding paradox.
Totally. Thank you for sharing your story. I think that's going to really help a lot of listeners. Yeah, I maybe to just share a few things that came to mind in terms of overcoming narcissism that your story brought up. One, and I guess this is what we're talking about today, it can be very helpful to acknowledge the reality that narcissism is there. And if we're unwilling, of course, to acknowledge our own narcissism, then we ain't going to overcome it. So if we can own it and own it as you were saying there, if we can own it gently, if we can own it with compassion, not self-flagellation, but like, yeah, I have some narcissism. How, how couldn't I have had it? How wouldn't I have? And then we can start to be on the lookout for it.
Hmm.
Now, one thing that comes to mind that your story brought up for me is back to this otherness, back to this willingness to expand in the face of otherness as opposed to contract. And particularly otherness within the self. Of
Hmm.
course, it's otherness outside the self too. But what struck me about your story is the in way you eventually incorporated the part of you you had to necessarily at an earlier stage deny, the dependent part of you, the part that needs. And as we lovingly incorporate the parts of us that are other, then that's on an internal process, the same thing that we're going to be doing out here in terms of overcoming our narcissism, bringing others in, allowing others to be there, not keeping others at a distance, whether it's our own emotional vulnerability, threatening feelings, or whether it's the person that's triggering those vulnerabilities and those feelings. So that could be part of what you were saying with like the paradox, like holding the paradox, because oftentimes I suppose the other is the opposite of the thing we're used to. And so holding paradox, accepting, allowing for, giving room for other, in our own self and out externally, those seem to be ways to overcome our narcissism. Um, one
I
other
think that's beautifully said.
Thank you. One other thing I'll just briefly mention as we wrap up, and because this is Don Carveth talks about this in his psychoanalysis, and on some level it resonates as true with me. He talks about the capacity to feel guilt as being an essential means of overcoming our narcissism. Guilt is such a painful emotion. Somehow, and when we know we fucked up and we've hurt somebody, it's really, really hard for a lot of people to just acknowledge and hold that reality. I hurt this person that I love. That's,
Yes.
oh, it's so painful. And so instead we deny it, we blame, no, you hurt me first. Or we self-flagellate. I'm such a piece of shit.
Shame.
What's
Yeah,
wrong with
it
me? I
becomes
can,
shame.
yeah, we make it all about us. We retreat into a different version of narcissism. But the capacity to feel guilt for the pain we maybe even inadvertently cause the people we love is also the bridge to overcoming that narcissism. That's part of the act of care, concern, and love. So
Ah, absolutely. And I like for further podcasts, I think we could dive so much deeper into this topic because it's so multi-layered because guilt now opens up another door. And I'll just say, like in the US punitive, like even our prison systems, right? Like the reason we can't feel guilt is because we have this black and white thinking that if you're guilty, you're a bad person, right? We like
exactly. Yes.
link guilt with badness, which is where the wound is stemming from in the first place, that we are feeling like we're not good enough, right? Like, so then we're perpetuating more of that maintenance of that mask rather than like understanding back to the root we just said. The narcissism stems from the wound. So it stems from victimization that we become perpetrators and then the wound, right? Like it is a full circle. And to be able to grieve our victimization allows us to own our perpetration, which allows us to heal that circle, right? So we have to do that inner work of, yes, I am narcissistic as well. And why am I narcissistic?
Mhm.
Because I was wounded in this place, right? And that's where we hold that tenderness for both what was done to us and what we have then done to others from that same place. So let's talk about guilt next time. Tune
Let's
on in.
let's yeah, to be continued. Awesome. Awesome. Well, what in a very enlightening conversation for me. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I love talking. See you
All right.
next time.
See you guys next time. Take care.